Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning coming at you live from Los Angeles, California.
And this is Dave Kaloran. I'm in Napa Valley today.
How is it up there, Dave?
It's always awesome here because there's a lot of wine, and I like wine.
Well, speaking of, I feel like the way to start things off for us this evening is to explore some very brief non-LSAT topics, one of which, that I know is of mutual interest to us both, is a cocktail for the evening. So, Dave, if I can put you on the spot, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, interestingly enough, it's not wine. Got to drink the classic. If it's going to be episode 1, I got to have a White Russian, which is my most favored drink of all time.
Well, there you go. I suppose if we're doing desert island drinks, that explains my choice too, which is a very old Macallan. Old enough to drink itself legally, in fact. I'm pretty happy about it. So if you guys hear occasional sips through the mic, that's what we're up to. But that's not the only thing we're up to as we start out. Dave, I know you want to talk a little bit about a song that's kind of been on your mind for this evening too.
I do, but kind of like as a background, one of the things we plan to do is to just put out a song weekly that matches what we're talking about. And so the song for today, which we've linked in the podcast description, is from a band from England called The Struts, who I absolutely love. And if you ever get a chance to see them live, I could not recommend it highly enough. They are fantastic live. And the song's called Who Am I? And as we talk about the LSAT and what's happening with the people over at LSAC this year, I think you'll see how this plays into all of that, because I think they're a little confused as to who they actually are right now.
Which is the main thrust of this evening. I can echo Dave's support of the Struts as well, having seen them live with him. In fact, they are objectively fantastic. I can't say that about all Dave's music choices. But in this instance, he's done us all quite a favor.
Why do you have to be like that, honestly?
Sometimes I'll pick the music and then we won't have a fight.
You're going to start cracking on my music already.
Yeah, already. Right at the jump.
That sure didn't take long.
So let's take a slightly longer view of the 2019 calendar. And I think the place to start is, interestingly enough, with a bit of a retrospective. Let's talk about what's happened through the first month of the year as we lead into what's coming.
Well, obviously January is a big year because probably most importantly, you just had an LSAT that got thrown at us this past weekend.
That's
so
right.
We're going to talk about that and kind of like get into that. But January really started off with, I think, something interesting. They released their digital LSAT tool. And so if you have not had a chance to actually see this yet, first off, prepare yourself because it does not look like anything from the modern age. All right. I've described it as an Atari Pong game, and most of you probably wouldn't remember what that is, but it was like the very first computer game, and it has got the worst graphics of all time. So maybe think about something that has worse than Minecraft graphics. It's just terrible. But it's at familiar.lsac.org, and it shows you what the digital interface will be like. And we're going to talk about the digital interface tonight and the test itself, for sure, the July test. So they did that. They also released the availability for the June and July LSAT, so you could register for those.
That's right. Yeah, you can actually get registered for the next 3 tests as of this recording. So March, June, and July, each of which we're going to talk about individually. I'd love to give LSAC a little bit of hip retro credit. But no, I think the software just legitimately sucks. Unintentionally terrible. But if you have a chance to play around with it, I think you'll at least discover the ability to get familiar with what the new digital interface is going to look like. And then we can all judge together.
Yeah, well, you're all going to agree with us anyway because it is objectively awful.
Yeah.
I don't think there can be no dispute. It's not allowable here. But the big thing that happened this month was obviously the January LSAT. Mm-hmm. So they threw that test down this weekend, and it was a pretty interesting weekend, I thought, overall. And most interesting to me is that when you really look at this, the way it's set up, is that there are 5 separate types of LSATs that are given. And through those 5 different LSATs, they actually used 4 different test forms. So if you're doing the math out there, obviously they reused at least one of those.
That's right.
But if you think about it, there's a Saturday test that's really like the domestic US-Canada test, which is what the majority of people took. So we want to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there was 4 other tests that also kind of came out at the same time. There were 2 versions of the international test. There's one that's more European And then there's another one that's more towards Asia and New Zealand,
Australia,
and those areas. Yeah, and interestingly enough, they reuse tests for that. So like the European test that was given really kind of like on Saturday, they used the December 2016 test that they'd used in Europe. So not the regular 2016 test, but the European 2016 test from December. And then in Asia, they used the September 2017, again, the European test. So just kind of tracking those kinds of things gets really kind of difficult. And then you had the Sabbath test on Monday, and for that, they chose the February 2015 LSAT. So there they are floating around. They're throwing that down. And finally, you've got the accommodated test takers who come through. And they're the ones that kind of got like the hodgepodge. They got a little bit of the Saturday test, and then you had some others who actually had the same test as the Sabbath takers, the February 15 LSAT. And honestly, just even trying to describe it is confusing to me. I would imagine in Newtown that it is quite confusing to try to, keep track of all of this. Of course,
anyone just listening to that even, and I'm sitting here among them, is I'm sure at least on some level scratching their head trying to figure out what happened where. So imagine being the ones who have to coordinate this sort of thing in advance. I envy them not at all.
Me neither.
Yeah.
But the question is why do they reuse all these tests so much?
Well, you want to talk about that? All right, was it a hypothetical, or should we explore it?
No, I was actually posing that question to you.
Okay, well, I can actually answer this very firsthand because I've had a chance to talk to some of the people, the psychometricians, emphasis on psycho, who make these exams, and they've told me exactly how much a new LSAT costs. And it's not cheap. It's about $750,000 a test, apparently, to design a new LSAT. I think I'm allowed to say that.
I think you are.
Okay.
Also, inflation, because it used to be $500,000 back in the 90s.
It's certainly not getting any cheaper. So with that kind of expense outlay to design a brand new test, especially one that's going to be administered on a huge scale, like full-on North American test, they're really tied down a little bit. You start to look around and they can't afford to make 5 brand new tests every time. So what do? They have to pull them out of the reserves.
They do, but why don't they reuse some of these tests more judiciously? Why do they give the Sabbath test takers a completely different exam than the Saturday people, and yet at the same time, they allow the accommodated test takers to have a mixture of the two?
Well, that's a question I wish I had as clear an answer to. Yeah, why do people take the test on Monday with accommodations, get the same test as Saturday, which they've heard about, but people taking the test on Monday as Sabbath observers get some brand new test that's different?
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Anyway, trying to figure out LSAC
answer, right?
is a ridiculous exercise in many cases. So I have a love-hate relationship with them. I love the tests. I have a lot of questions about some of the things they do. This is certainly one of them. But let's talk about that Saturday test, because that's the one that the majority of people took. And first off, it's a non-disclosed test, which means that all of you who took that exam are not going to see it. They may release it eventually, but usually you're talking about 5-10 years down the road that it comes out. And at that point, I don't think any of you will really care that test is out. I'll be there and I'll be like, I remember this exam from January, but you won't see it, which means you also won't see your answers. You won't see how many you got right or wrong. There's really no way to know exactly what happened.
Scoring scale doesn't get released, so you'll never know not only how many you missed, but how many you could miss for various results.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, all that's kept secret.
Yeah, you basically get your score, your percentile, a score band, and then incredibly generously, I've always enjoyed this part, they give you a copy of your writing sample. I'm like, that's not the part of the LSAT that I want. I want the actual questions. Oh no, here's my writing sample. Look, Mom, I did a great writing sample.
Everyone clamoring for their essay.
Yeah, was it? Useless. The question there is, was it a kitchen remodel or was it, the new HVAC system that you get to put in there?
Have you picked a team yet? Have you chosen a side?
I don't know. I'd really have to see the details of it to know for sure, but I love the fact that people have like a very strong opinion about this. Like, I'm team kitchen and I'm team AC, that kind of thing. I think that's pretty cool. But let's talk a little bit about what the actual LSAT questions were on this. And let's start with logic games, because that's always, I think, this part that people want to start at. And so you had 4 games that were out there. You had the 7 computer installations that were thrown out. And I've heard kind of a mix of feedback on this. I've heard some people say that it was not bad, and I've heard other people say it actually created a sequence that was rather challenging to deal with. The second game was about different colored statues and pillars and ordering them like shortest to tallest. I've heard a lot of people complain about this game, that it had some challenges to it. So I think probably that game, and as we'll see, the fourth game, were probably the two that I've heard the most complaints about. The third game was about, it's been called the banking game, but it was like two branches of a company that were on the east and the west, and then they had a couple of different departments.
Three, yeah.
Three of them: investments, loans, and mortgages. And I don't think that game was easy. I don't know, the full scope of the difficulty of it. I've heard complaints, but not as many as, say, the second or fourth game. And then the last game was the building with the 9 apartments, the luxury, modern, and traditional, going on three floors. Yeah. So I think the last game in any of these tests is always feels more difficult because typically when you get there, you don't have as much time. And so you're getting to the end and you're like, you feel pressured. Even if the game was inherently easier, it would still feel a little bit harder because you're like, I'm out of time.
Yeah. So, and let's be honest, there's always the fatigue factor as well. Nobody goes into the fourth game feeling fresh.
Yeah. The first couple of people that I talked to actually had kind of like high level scores and a little bit of an instructional background. And their take on this section was it was fair. They didn't think it was as hard. And as the day went on, I started to hear more reports that kind of changed my perspective on this. But we'll come back to that.
Which we will come to for sure.
Yeah. So then you had the reading comprehension on this exam. And the thing I will say about it is you didn't have anybody coming out complaining. It was like this was a normal reading comprehension section, which means it wasn't easy, but it also wasn't like Eileen Gray lacquer level of difficulty out there. There's no Kate Chopin kind of situation that people were like, oh my gosh, that was the hardest passage I've seen in ages. So let's run down at least what the real
let's go through
passages were. So you had a comparative passage that opened up this particular section, and that doesn't happen that often, John.
Yeah, I know. In fact, what is this, I think the third time since released comparative passages have come out in 2007, right?
Yeah, I think there's 3 on
3 prior,
tests.
so maybe this is the 4th.
This is the 4th one, and obviously non-disclosed,
right.
But that's 3 out of the 36 that have been released. So
that's right.
It doesn't happen very often. And I think the last time it happened was 2016. It happened on back-to-back tests.
Well, let me put you on the spot a little bit and get your take on that. What's your feeling on starting with comparative? Is that just another day? Does that make it easier, better, worse? What do you think?
I like comparative reading. So for me, starting with it would feel pretty good. I like it because the arguments don't develop as deeply, and they're both kind of related to the same type of topic usually. So you can kind of use them to almost bounce that information off the two. And I like the questions. That comparative thing, I think that's a big part of doing well on the LSAT. So for me, if somebody said, you're going to have comparative first, my response would be, great.
Yeah, same. I tell that to my students all the time, that I think it's actually a gift that they've added this. Instead of one long passage that delves super deep and often ramblingly into various places, you get 2 people who have to get to the point faster. Yeah, I like that.
I would have to agree with you on that. And of course, the first passage in any of these sections usually isn't the most difficult one.
Typically, yeah.
And I can't remember the last time that actually happened. But it's the same thing in games. Usually, I don't think of LSAC as benevolent, but here there's a degree of benevolence where they're like, you guys, we're going to start you off with something reasonable. We'll wait till later to hit you in the head with a baseball bat. Thanks, guys.
I can't see you right now, but I suspect you're doing air quotes around benevolence, as you should.
A little bit.
But yeah, I mean, in the scheme of LSAC generosity, that is definitely high.
Yeah. So anyway, this comparative passage was about playwrights in different countries, and you're comparing cultures and so forth. So not too bad from the sound of it. Nobody really complained about it. It was just like, well, there was this passage and this is what it was. Then you had a passage that's been largely talked about, like Pueblo Indians and the crab supernova. Probably the crab supernova is the easiest way to describe this. So that passage also, even though it had some kind of like science and history elements to it, doesn't seem to have been that bad overall, which is great because that's what you want in something that's a little bit, has something science-y mentioned in it. You don't want high levels of difficulty. Third passage is about copyright and trademark law, kind of like your classic. Yeah. Legal related passage. And then this section ended with a discussion of placebos and drug research. So there was not a whole lot of talk either online or even from instructors that I heard where they were like complaining about this. I don't think the difficulty was low, but I also don't think it was high. It's been a lot like the recent reading comprehension, which has been consistently at a level that challenges you but doesn't destroy you. So, like I said before, I mentioned Eileen Gray and the lacquer passage. That's a destroyer level passage where people were like, I know I'm getting worked over right here. There's nothing fun in that.
For sure. Yeah, and speaking of consistency, the logical reasoning, I think, holds up pretty well to the last couple of tests that we've seen as well.
Yeah. And I think that's actually dangerous, though, because the last few tests, to me, I've actually enjoyed them immensely. Like from a teaching perspective and an analytical perspective, when I look at the questions, sometimes I'm like, whoa, these guys are good. You know, I have a healthy degree of respect for the people who make this test. And I've looked at some of the LR on like September and November, and I'm like, I can't wait to teach this. You know, it's so good and it's constructed in such a way that is really, it just explains what they're thinking. I want to get in there and do that. But the thing that I noticed about these sections was that the difficulty, it wasn't kept until later. And they would, you know, I think one of the passages in November, question 2, I think is brutally difficult for somebody who's not reading or paying attention closely. And that's the kind of thing that you didn't see like 10 or 15 years ago.
That's right.
So my concern initially was, you know, people were like, oh, the LR was very reasonable. And then as I kept talking to people throughout the day, I started to develop a slightly different opinion of that. And the recent LSATs have been what I call sneaky hard when it comes to LR.
You're
like,
about to freak people out who are feeling good, by the way, just as a preface.
Thanks. You can thank me later for that. But that doesn't mean that the test was hard itself. No. This clearly wasn't among the hardest LSATs. I think most people would say it was a fair test. And if you've studied recent LR, as you should have, and as we've been telling people, then you would have been prepared for this. You just have to read really closely. You cannot assume things. They've gotten very sophisticated in making answer choices that kind of hit on tangential issues.
That's a good word for it.
Better than they used to be.
Yeah, you and I have been pretty notably vocal about this. I think the word I keep coming back to for the last couple of tests has been how slippery it's been. That right answers are better disguised than I've seen a lot of prior tests, pre-September tests, and wrong answers are more attractive.
Yeah, frankly. You call it slippery. I've called it sneaky. We're both right when it comes to that. If you look at that section, you know, there were clearly some difficult questions out there. The porpoise question has been thrown around a lot as being challenging. There was a question about locomotives and steam engines. That was another tough one. The burglary systems question clearly was difficult. And, you know, we get a really good sense of like how these questions are made and where the directions that the answers take and things like that. But at the same time, I can't wait to see it because I'm like, ooh, how tough was it?
And we never will, which is
you're right about that. I always forget about those things.
I know.
But one of the things we had said before this test was that we thought it would be a new LSAT that they administered, and that essentially this was taking the place of the February exam. And that's exactly what happened. So at least we were right about that. It wasn't a repeat test. I think, you know, March, when that test gets closer, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But as far as this test, this was pretty much what we kind of expected to see here. And I felt good about it. I think overall, the responses that I got from students in particular were fairly positive.
Yeah.
And that's
I think anyone feeling good about September and November should have been well positioned for this test. There was a lot of linearity, which is almost the entirety of November, which is rare. Yeah. So, yeah, it was, I think, a very fair test, very much in line. Nothing crazy happened here. But again, we find ourselves in a position of having to play blind detective, really, because we'll never see it.
No, we never will.
But that didn't stop you, my friend, from talking a little bit about how you feel it'll be scored. So let me, again, put you on the spot and have you explain a little bit, not only where your initial estimations were, but how they evolved as more information came.
Are you saying that I changed my mind during the course of the day? Is that the...
I mean, you do feel a little bit, a little bit hard to pin down sometimes.
Yes, and that is my ever-changing nature. No, in fact, my initial kind of like preliminary estimate was that it was going to be -10. And that was based upon, I had talked to a few instructors and I had talked to a fair selection of students. And as I figured out later on, I had ended up talking to a really high scoring segment of people. And I've kind of felt like listening to what they were saying, it was reasonable and they were right. But as the day went on and I talked to more people and I sifted a few more reports, I started to feel like that the logic games were harder than I initially thought. And the same was the case with the LR. And, one student had told me, at one point, it'd be like, oh, this LR was really easy. And I was so busy at the time, I didn't really focus on it. But I thought about it later on, and I was like, anytime somebody says that to you, that's actually a really bad sign. Because no LR is really easy. It doesn't matter how good you are at this. There's always difficult questions. It's always a challenge. Even if I feel like I got all the questions right in a section, I still don't think it was easy to do it. This test is just too well made for that. And usually when you have that type of response, like, oh, that's an easy thing, that's an easy section, an easy question, what you're really looking at is that there's a little bit of difficulty where somebody missed the right answer and didn't realize it.
Right. Yeah, they fell victim to some sort of trap that was appealing, but wrong.
Yeah, in the LRB, there's a question from a number of years back. It's the beverage company representative question. It's in the weekend section.
Classic.
One of my favorite questions of all time. It's why it's in the book. It's in our courses as well. And the thing that I love about that is that you go through it the first time, and if you're not reading carefully, you get to the end and you choose the wrong answer. And when I used to tutor on that question and teach it in class, I would always come back to the same thing. I would say, all right, how many people think that it's E or whatever the most attractive wrong answer is? And 90% of the room, if not more, would be like, oh, that's it. And I'm like, you all just missed the question and you had no idea. So let's talk about how do we avoid this?
Not only did they pick the wrong answer, but with confidence.
Oh, yeah.
Just like, oh, well, obviously, I'll bet the mortgage.
I've nailed this.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is such a dangerous position to be in because you feel that you are irrefutably correct and it turns out that you're not. You're standing on quicksand. And so that's the kind of thing that really negatively affects scores. And I'm not saying there were a bunch of questions like that. Like if somebody's listening and they're like, did he just, that whole section was like, no, I'm just saying there's probably a few questions that might have been a little bit harder than they looked at first.
September and November both stood out for that exact reason.
Completely.
And I think this test is probably going to be a third in a row.
I would agree. But going back to your point, the scaling initially when I thought it was -10, once I felt like LR and LG might have a few greater difficulty elements, I then made the official prediction at -11 to get a 170. So
yeah, well, so I'm actually going to cut you off really quickly, not to be
Thanks,
terribly rude.
I appreciate you cutting me
fine.
off.
Only to elaborate for the uninitiated as to what a -10 or a -11 means, because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to it and be like, what in the world is -10?
You didn't think I was just going to explain this? But
well,
by all means, please go right ahead.
Do you want me to do it? Okay.
No, yes, you do it.
All right. So with a standardized test as the LSAT, if I'm going to get really fundamental with this, the main objective of the test makers is to keep things consistent. And that's a very hard thing to do over the span of 100 questions and 4 different logic games and all sorts of various elements that change test to test. And the way that they can adjust this, or at least keep things more, again, standardized and consistent, is that they can change the nature of how they translate a raw score, how many questions you get right and wrong, into a final scaled score out of 180, between 120 and 180. So they adjust each test up and down just a little bit. And the typical metric that's used is the number that you can miss to get a 170 on the test, which I think these days, Dave, is about a 97th percentile or so. It used to be around 98. So when we talk about -10, -11, -12, or 14, what we're talking about is the number of questions that you can miss out of however many total there were, 100, 101 on this particular test in January, and still hit that 170 number, which I know for a lot of people is an ambitious but constant target. So when we talk about -10, that is a test where people perform slightly better than a test where you can miss 11. And that's a little bit of an easier test than where you could miss -12 or -14. The more you can miss, obviously, the harder the test overall was. So as a quick indulgence into a tangent, that's what those numbers mean.
Exactly. And, the nice thing is once you've taken the test, at that point, it doesn't matter. Whatever the number of questions you've answered correctly is kind of like in the book. So you'd, at that point, prefer to have a test that had a larger number that you could miss for that. So when I moved it to -11, the general response was like, all right, stoked about that. this is, and in the past, I've done this long enough now. And I think I've had the experience where I'm pretty accurate. I'm either right on the money or one off. And it drives me crazy when I'm one off, but what are you going to do? You just have to accept it. This is one of those cases where I'm not going to know. I'll know eventually, and then I'll be able to check myself, but it could be years.
None of us will potentially ever know with a non-disclosed test.
One of the things that's kind of interesting, though, in the aftermath of any of these given LSATs is people trying to figure out the experimental section. And there's a lot of questions about that. And obviously, one of the things that we attempt to do is to very quickly figure it out. And as East Coast test takers had left, I think probably within 20 or 30 minutes on my Twitter feed, I had started posting the real reading comprehension sections and then the real LG sections and so forth and some of the LR. But one of the things that came up, and you see this online especially, is that there were a ton of experimental sections. In logic games, they tested at least 3 or 4 different sections. Reading comprehension was at least 2 or 3. There's a multitude of LR experimentals being tested. That actually causes a lot of confusion. Because someone comes out and if they had, say, 3 LRs, that's the worst possible scenario for figuring out the experimental because you just have so many questions. And then, you're dealing with 75 or so questions that are floating around. Other people had 75 questions, but they had 25 that were different than yours because they had a different experimental. So if you go online or you're looking at these lists and you're like, I never saw that question and I had 3 experimental LRs, don't worry about it. It just means that someone else's experimental LR was different than yours. The reason they're doing that, of course, and it's getting more intense now, is they are creating more LSATs for the future. They're under a lot of pressure, and that's what helped us predict the July LSAT last year was the fact that they didn't have a whole lot of tests in the chamber to fire for that one. And now they know they've got a situation coming where they're going to have 10 LSATs a year. Well, if that's coming, you better be testing a ton of experimentals. So this isn't going to change. This is like the new normal in terms of all the experimental stuff that's floating around. So, but scores will be out, mid-February? What's the...
Yeah,
is it
let me give
February
you the exact
15th, I think is
the exact date as to when these are meant to release.
It's that.
I'm getting there.
No, I know. It's February 15th.
15th. Okay, you're right.
It's LSAC's special post-Valentine's Day present to everybody.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. So,
and for those of you curious, or perhaps maybe history buffs, where they used to release anywhere up to 7, 8, 10 days, 12 days early, they don't do that anymore. So when they say Friday, February 15th, you can count on a Friday morning score release. That's what you're waking up to.
Yeah, usually 9 a.m. Eastern, give or take 5 or 10 minutes.
Pretty normal. After they learned their lesson about a midnight the night before release, that was a one and done terrible decision.
It was a terrible decision.
Yes, it was.
Anyway, well, at least I asked them to change it, and they did that.
Yeah,
so.
Actually, I'm pretty sure they heard you.
Yes, they did.
And
we listened. Don't you remember that hashtag?
I do remember that hashtag.
They actually listen to what we say.
But wouldn't it be better if that hashtag is "we thought"?
We thought beforehand.
We considered.
We pondered this problem and came up with the best decision before making the mistake.
Yeah, that's right. But then we wouldn't have their terrible software to make fun of. So,
I'm going to make fun of that probably the rest of my life. Well,
I suppose we're in some way beneficiaries. You talk about a lot more LSATs coming down the pipeline, which is absolutely true. And next year is going to be pure chaos. If you and I keep a podcast going through next year with drinks every night, it's a race to rehab.
Who's to say we're not already in rehab?
Well, yeah, this is coming to you from Betty Ford.
I'm going to need some LSAT rehab with the number of tests that are actually coming.
Please give me a break. Unfortunately, we don't get one because we're actually staring down another one coming up. You want to start to talk a little bit about the next several LSATs this year? All right. So the next one we've got is March.
Indeed. Which is an interesting test because they've never had a March LSAT before.
That's right.
So when you look at the old calendar, you usually had February and then June, and now they've added January and March. And so January's kind of taken the position of that February test, but March is completely new. Mm-hmm. So this is a test that a lot of law schools will accept. And I think as the admissions window continues going on, more and more schools will say, hey, we'll take that March results. This has been a very slow cycle. If you've been watching the admits coming out and the waves that everybody's hoping for, it's not going very fast, especially compared to last year, which was already an odd year.
Yeah.
So that March test is pretty useful. And if you get stuck onto a wait list or something like that, March can be a really good test to take. If you bump up your score a couple of points, that can move the needle on your status or even increase, some of the financials that you might get offered.
That's right. Yeah, and the schools that we've talked to about the March test specifically have been, for the most part, pretty accommodating, pretty open to accepting results. Not every school's going to take it, but I think the majority will, and I also think that number is going to continue to grow through the spring.
So maybe if you just took January and you're like, I don't know how I felt about it, I want to take the next one, you have until February 20th to register for that March test.
That's right.
There is still time.
So let's talk a little bit about March, partly in terms of what we expect and just partly the logistics of it. It's a March 30th, which is a Saturday morning, just like this January test was for North America, another non-disclosed test. So the same deal applies. People will get a score and a percentile scoring band, but they won't see their answers. They won't see the test content. It's another opportunity for LSAC to potentially reuse an old test. And Dave, I don't know if you've made your mind up about this. I have a suspicion.
No, I really haven't. I think they're going to reuse a recent test, so maybe I have made up my mind.
Yeah, you really hedged.
I don't know.
Quite the pause.
But I think it's this. Well done. I think it's going to be a reuse, and I'm really interested to see what the reuse is going to be because I also suspect that July of this year is going to be a reuse of a recent test. And so whatever they do in March here will affect that July test. And obviously, we'll keep a really close eye on that. Just like last year when we were able to tell people, hey, do a circular game that has like double stacks to it. Hopefully, we can come up with something similar for the upcoming July exam. And who knows? I mean, there's some candidates for March here. I don't know that it's worth it to really go into detail about any of it because it's such a broad array of options. Yeah,
especially when you start to flirt with all these international tests and Sabbath observer tests. I mean, there's dozens of candidates. I think July we can probably put something a little bit more specific on, which we will do in the coming months. Not to keep you in suspense, but we're going to keep you in suspense.
No, if you actually are in suspense, I talked about it at the end of our November Crystal Ball seminar. The last 10 minutes of that seminar are basically a discussion of that July test and what the options are. And that was preliminary. And we said back then that what they do in January and March would have an effect. And, obviously we still have to wait for March. So we'll see what happens. Yeah. But after March, the next LSAT is June. Mm-hmm. And normally you'd think that's just another June LSAT. But this one's actually, I think, a really interesting one. I'm very interested to see what they do because they have decided finally, after 1,000 years, to remove the writing sample from test day. So I'm happy about that because I always thought it was ridiculous.
Great news.
Yeah. Well, I would literally write stuff like, can't you tell that option A is far superior to option B? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that makes you look like a jerk. But at the same time, I was like, I'm not going to write a whole lengthy thing about this, but you have to write something. Otherwise, they might not score your test.
They reserve the right to refuse to score it. Yeah, which is why my last official LSAT, the writing sample was just me saying I had a severely sprained wrist and couldn't complete the writing sample.
How'd you fill in all those Scantrons?
Painfully. It was rough, Dave.
Well, you got through it though, man.
I did.
Just a warrior.
I did. And it turns out it worked out. Most of those Scantrons were okay.
Yeah, they scored it at least.
So when you talk about them removing the writing sample, it's not quite as generous as that could seem at first glance.
I said removing it from test day.
Exactly. So I think we should put a finer point on this as to exactly what that means.
Yes.
You do still have to complete a writing sample.
You do. You just don't have to complete it the day of the LSAT.
Right.
And you don't have to go to a test center to complete it. You can complete it from a computer.
That's right. And no one will judge your handwriting anymore.
No, they won't. They'll just judge your typing speed now.
Your
I'm sure they will get all the biometric data they can from people with webcams and everything. But
that's an interesting point, which they haven't released the details of. I don't know how they're going to ensure security that you can't have Stephen King come write it for you or someone.
Is that really who you want?
I don't know. He's the first one that came. He was prolific. He was the first one that came to mind.
How about Michael Lewis or somebody like that?
Oh, actually, you're fine.
Does a little more fact-based.
Gladwell
analysis.
Comes in and just makes a bunch of stuff up. That's fine.
There you go. The security for this,
Sorry.
Whatever. I suspect the security won't be that great, but who cares? It's the writing sample. If you're going to have somebody write it for you.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah,
'Cause
the
there's
easier
just-
question is who doesn't care? Because the
Yeah.
answer to that is schools.
True.
Yeah, for the most part. We don't need to get too deep into exactly how it's treated, but I would say for the most part, the writing sample has been an afterthought at best.
I would have to agree with that. Usually if I talk to law school admissions officers, you hear like, yeah, I look at them every once in a while. If I have suspicions about the candidate or I want to confirm something, I'll glance at it. I don't think it's a make or break kind of piece. Like, oh, you wrote an incredible writing sample and that's why we admitted you to Yale. That is not going to happen.
Right.
However, I can see a school saying, I'm on the fence about this person. This writing sample is really poor. You're out. So
That's the way I explain it to people a lot of times. It's probably not going to get you in, but if you just botch it, it could keep you out.
it's a deal breaker,
It
not a
could
deal
be.
maker.
That's
Is
right.
that-
Yeah. It can close a door, but it probably won't open one. But the way this new one's going to work is they're going to have you do it from home at your
Yeah.
own computer, typing away, with a window of, I think, about 2 weeks post-test.
Oh, is that what it is?
I believe so. I'm still waiting.
Confirmation.
Yeah, all of this is still new news. So we'll see exactly what the details are when they release it, which will probably be in the next month or two.
Okay. Well, obviously, when that information comes out, we will break it down
sure.
thoroughly and talk about it. But the good news here is that this is a forever change. This is going to happen, and then all future LSATs, you don't have to take the writing sample. So you save 30 minutes, 35 minutes extra in LSAC's tender loving care at the test center.
Let me double down on forever. It's not only a forever change in the sense that new LSATs will have this, but your writing sample is now forever. You do one, and it applies to all future tests. You don't have to do a writing sample for every subsequent LSAT.
Excellent.
So it's, yeah,
You
doubly
better hope
permanent.
you get a good topic.
Doubly permanent. I know, right?
What if you get a topic you just hate? Can you ask to retake it? These
That's
are
a
the
good
burning
question,
questions
too.
that I have.
Yeah, that's probably the question of the night.
I know that LSAC, if I posed that question to them, they would probably give me that look that's like, really, Dave?
Yeah.
Are you really asking us that right now?
That's the look I'm making right now.
Fair enough. Well,
is-
I will ask that question when the time is right.
Yeah, we'll see what else they release about it. But that is the good news. The writing sample is becoming more and more marginalized, as it deserves to be.
And you see thematically, when I was talking about that Strut song earlier and the song Who Am I, which I completely recommend that you listen to because it's a fabulous song. This is a good example because they're remaking themselves. They're trying to figure out who they are. Obviously, they're competing with the GRE and now they're throwing off the writing sample. They're going digital. They are in a state of flux. They're
It's
like
a crisis of self-identity, really.
they're like a teenager.
That's right. LSAC puberty. That's what we're witnessing right now.
Who am I? I have no idea. What am I going to do?
Everything's changing.
After that June test, then you have another July test. So we had one last year that was really announced on very short notice. And that timeline gave us a really unique ability to make predictions about that test. This July test is really a landmark test, but for completely different reasons.
Right.
And this is the transition from paper to digital. So unlike the way I would have done it, which is like, okay, that's the last paper test, and here's the new digital test, which I think is kind of a cool way to do it. Just hand it off. It's
Clean
like a
break.
baton. Yeah.
Nope.
What they are saying is they are going to use what they call best practices for test transition. So the fact that that exists already tells you that, they've studied this pretty closely. Whether or not it is, I'll take their word for it. But what it does mean is that this is a more or less half paper, half digital administration, meaning some people will walk into the test center and get a paper version. Other people will get the digital version, which is done on tablet. And
it gets worse.
It gets worse because instead of you knowing beforehand so you kind of mentally prepare, you don't find out until you get there.
That's right.
So it's kind of like going to a casino, and if you really want one outcome, you don't know if you're going to get that. You might, but there's going to be that anxiety and trepidation as you build into actually being there. So,
and it's going to be center to center, I have to presume. Some centers are going to get sent a ton of Microsoft Go tablets or whatever they're called, Surface Pro something.
yeah.
And then some are going to get a whole stack of paper tests. Some places are going to have you with a number 2 pencil, and some will have you with a stylus. And
Yeah, I would think
know.
they're gonna mingle it a little bit.
do you think
You
so?
also-
At the same center, you think there'll be some, not in the same room,
Not in the same room. Definitely not. That would be irritating.
Well,
and
it's worse than irritating. It's impossible. The test self-proctors versus the paper where it has to be human. So,
yes,
right.
that is irritating.
That feels like a patronizing explanation to you, and I'm sorry for it.
No. I completely understand
You're
it.
like, yes, I get it.
But going back to the test center, not at a small test center, not with 100 people.
Multiple
or
rooms, you
75
think
people.
they could divide it up?
Someplace like UCLA where
Different break times and all that?
you don't need to worry about what another room is doing. If you have 5 rooms full of students taking this, you could easily have 2 of them be on tablet. They could run their exact schedule, and it would have nothing to do with the people who are taking the paper test. It wouldn't even bother them, other than the noise, which it's quite clear LSAC has proven they could care less about noise caused by other people in the test center.
I mean, not only could they care less, they don't pay attention. Could not
They
care less.
actively ignore the issue.
Yeah, if anything, I think they're hiring marching bands to just go around and bang cymbals.
Who's going to set the fire alarm off this week?
Yeah.
Or, hey, make sure all the proctors have gum and that they chew
who's
with
bringing the
their mouths
boombox
open.
for the room next door? It's a mess.
It's a dance
you know,
party.
Dave, you and I are notorious for gambling on the most minute of things. Let's wager. We'll make it official right now.
Okay.
I don't think they're going to mix sinners.
Okay, and I think they will. What's the wager, though?
Ooh, what are the stakes?
I don't know. Something reasonable but not too extravagant.
We'll come up with something.
Yeah, you're going to put on the spot. You're literally
I
like,
know, I'm actually stumped.
You're giving
Because I don't want to say anything that's reasonable to me, and someone listens and they're like, well, that guy's an asshole. I won't do that.
It's not going to be like a Paul Reed Smith guitar or anything.
Exactly.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So the other thing about that July test, aside from the fact that, hey, you get to walk in and get dealt whatever cards are going to be dealt for the day, is that it comes along with, I think, a rather incredible feature. And it's a one-time only feature. It only applies to the July test. And that is you get to preview your score before deciding to keep or cancel that score. That's never happened before. They're saying it will never happen again. I think that's stupid. There are other major standardized tests at the graduate level that do this, that allow you to see your score before you lock it in. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it. But this is the one and only time that for the LSAT, you will be able to take the test regardless of the format and then actually make that decision.
That's right. And it gets better.
It does get better. If you cancel your score, you then get to take the LSAT for free anytime.
Until April of 2019. Or
Exactly.
2020, rather. Yeah, 6 more months. You've got a free retake on
So-
your record. Yeah.
Not bad. And then you, of course, don't have to take the writing sample. And if you took June, you've got your writing sample locked in.
Yeah, even better.
It's got some really nice features to it.
So let me ask you, when students have approached you about the July test, because obviously it comes with a tremendous degree of uncertainty, trepidation, anxiety, that you don't know exactly what your test is even going to look like as you look down at your seat. Have you been encouraging them to take it? Or
Yes.
have you been steering them elsewhere?
No, I've been saying that if you feel comfortable with the digital format, take it.
Okay. How are you telling students to get comfortable with the digital format?
Well, that great LSAC familiarization tool is the starting point, John.
Well, yeah. But what good advice are you giving?
Yeah. What useful tips have you given people? Well, the first thing is that you're going to see digital tools coming out over the course of the spring and the summer. Okay. So, for example, we're
you can
building our own.
self-promote because I intend to.
Yeah, well, we're building our own interface so that we can deliver a ton of our content in a digital format that will more or less emulate what the test interface looks like. So, in fact, the digital change is sparking huge changes in the courses that we have and the way that we give material to students and how they actually learn. I'm really quite excited about it. So for me, the digital transition is one of the most positive things that I have seen in years.
I agree.
I realize that there's that moment of alarm where you're like, what the heck's going on? And from a test taking and a student perspective, it's like, I wish this wasn't happening. I'd rather go with the tried and true. But at least from the direction this is taking things, I'm pretty excited about it. But the key thing is this, is if you're a student who's thinking about taking July, you have to ask yourself, can you manage the risk and anxiety over which format you get? Can you handle it? Or is it going to drive you nuts? Because if it's going to drive you nuts, you don't want to go into a test where you're like, all your nerves are jangled because you just don't know the test format. So that's really the first question. But if you can manage it and you're like, I don't care, or it's not that big of a deal, then the second question is, if you get the digital format, will you be comfortable working within it? Now, my take is you will be. You can be. You
do your due diligence, and you absolutely have every opportunity to succeed in that.
More so than that, even without being specifically versed in how the tools work, I still think that the average student of today would feel completely comfortable. You got a phone? You ever used an iPad?
Right.
The answer is always yes. This isn't all that far off. Yes, the interface is from 1984, but I mean, aside from that, you can still use it. It does some cool things. You can always see the timer counting down. One of my students, or certainly a student that I'm friendly with, she was down in Florida and the proctor screwed up her timing in multiple sections. And of course, it's a disaster because
Central Florida this weekend, right?
Yeah, it's a complete disaster. There's an official filed, complaint. The proctor's already acknowledged that mistakes were made. This fundamentally changes her options in terms of where she is applying and what tests that those schools will accept. And it's an adverse situation.
The potential for human error is off the table. Yeah. That's true. I've taken the digital LSAT, the very first pilot test, as you well know. And there were things about it I really liked a lot. There's nothing to be afraid of. It takes a little adjustment. But once you've spent some time with the new software, with the new platform, you're fine. I can't recommend July highly enough.
Me either. Just the score. Because let's say you go in
it's
there
so
and
mitigated.
You get destroyed.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there's no consequence.
You just cancel your score. Nobody really cares. And they're not going to be like, you couldn't handle the digital test, man.
No one knows. They don't even know. Schools won't even know you had a digital test.
It's not like there's some kind of judgment. Somebody had actually asked me that online. They're like, well, will they assume this? I'm like, they don't assume anything because they're too busy doing other things.
It would do them no benefit to assume anyway. So no.
Exactly.
No. And schools don't care about a cancellation. There's nothing there to judge. They don't care.
1 or 2 cancellations never caused anybody to be looked at in any unusual way. 3 or more, I think 3 is the cutoff line.
I agree.
Once you go above 3, it's like, what's going on?
Probably got some explaining to do.
Yeah, and there are decent explanations. It's just, there's like an LSAC question about all these bad things happening, and it's like, wait a second, each time you had a cancellation, something terrible happened. You broke your leg. Right. Someone in your family died. You got into a car crash. Right. It's like, each of those individually can happen, but on successive LSATs, unlikely. So if you've got 1 or 2 cancellations, nobody cares about that. And law schools don't care. And so I wouldn't even worry about that situation.
The potential to be done early in the cycle, the potential to get a preview of the digital test if you end up having to take in September or later, which we'll talk about, and the ability to cancel once you've seen your results and realize they're good or bad. Like, man, why would you not be gunning for July? So I've told every student I've talked to, listen, if you want to gear up for June, do it. But July is a pretty sweet option.
Here's why you shouldn't take July. Because you should instead be by the pool or at the beach.
I see.
Or doing something that is fun. You should be traveling.
It's true. It is a Monday in the middle of the summer.
Thanks, guys.
You shouldn't take July if you've got anything better to do.
If you want to have a fun life.
Which is probable.
July sucks for that particular purpose. So, yeah, I think the test itself is fantastic. The timing of it, I hate. But
nobody interested in fun life goes to law school, though. So I think we've probably already weeded them out.
Not for 3 years,
Not for 3 years, right.
Well, I think they're going to get a large number of students taking it. So the one thing to think about is the registration's open. If you think you're going to take it, go register.
It's going to be a big test.
Yeah. I would say that you're going to see some test centers filling up, and probably it won't be all that long before they are filling up.
With only one type of test or the other, as my bet will prove.
So then once July is done, that kind of transitional best practices 50-50 approach, it's done as well. And the next LSAT after that is the September test. And this then completes the transition that LSAC's going through and trying to find themselves, because this is now then the first fully digital test. No more paper, at least domestically.
Yeah, that's right. And we should mention that internationally, you can still take the test with pencil and paper.
Yeah, so if you really are married to that format, that's right. A trip to Europe is justifiable.
One more benefit.
Can you imagine? Hey, Mom and Dad, I have to go to London, I swear. If I'd thrown that at my parents in college, they would have laughed at me.
You've had worse ideas.
They would have just been like, this is the stupidest thing you've ever come up with. You're going to go to London to take an American test.
You're going down the street.
So that September test, though, fully digital, no writing sample to deal with, no uncertainty when you walk in. You know you're going to be using the tablet, and at least, again, in the US and Canada. And so that is, at that point, the new format that is then used for all tests thereafter. And the bad or downside of this is that there is no instantaneous scoring. It still is going to take about 21 days, which is, of course, astonishing to me still today that they couldn't have gotten scores back faster. And I can see you shaking your head.
Well, I mean, at least a raw score, right? Yeah. I mean, I can vision us both shaking our head that they have every opportunity to be like, well, look, you got 87 right. We haven't confirmed the curve yet, but this is how many questions tentatively, unofficially, you've answered correctly. Why not?
Exactly. What's the harm?
Zero harm. The GMAT does it. The GRE does it. There's the most analogous tests that are out there do it. They now have this opportunity and seem to refuse.
Fumbled it is, with the Super Bowl coming up here, that's the term I'm going to use.
Defeat from the jaws of victory. Here's LSAC.
So a non-Brady-esque move.
That's right. This is them in the red zone, returning it to the wrong end zone. But
so wait a second though, 21 days for the score, but then no score preview. That's off the table at this point. Right. So
that's a July one and done.
Yeah, you choose to keep your score, you're going to get that, but you won't know what it is. It goes right back to the way it is today and how it was for this past weekend's LSAT.
Now, while we're making predictions, let's make another one. Do you think this will change eventually?
I think so, yeah.
I do too.
The pressure is, this is one of the great advantages of a digital test is instantaneous scoring. I know why they don't want to do it, but
it costs them nothing.
The official excuse when they give it, and they really don't want to talk about this as far as I've been able to tell, it's going to deal with the fact that, well, each LSAT, that everybody takes the same test, and that's not how the GRE and the GMAT work because they're more adaptive
question
and they
banks
change.
That adapt, section or question by question, right?
Exactly. So each individual GMAT and GRE taker has a slightly different exam. That's not the case with the LSAT, and that they still need to run all their statistics and analytics on this to make sure that the test is viable. We just saw a test where a question was removed.
Right.
And,
that was the 27th reading comp question in November, if anyone's interested.
Exactly. Which, if you took that test, that question was removed. But if you get the actual test booklet now, there's no question 27, and it doesn't even say question removed from scoring.
Which is
They just erased their mistake, and they're like, "Yeah, we didn't do that, guys, right?"
Spackling
Nobody
over
saw
history.
that.
That's right.
It's like somebody walking into a building and stumbling, and then looking around very quickly. Did anyone see me do that?
Delete the footage.
Yeah, we saw. So, that kind of situation that's what their official excuse is going to be, is that they are looking at a scenario where they still have to run those collective analytics and make sure it's a viable test. But there is no way on earth it takes 21 days.
No.
So
especially not. I mean, the scores will be sent to them digitally within seconds. They're done
instantaneously.
Yeah, right.
What they should do is what you just suggested, which is you got,
unofficial raw count.
Correct.
We haven't made the curve yet.
Yeah, that would actually be helpful, and then someone could go back and be like, "All right, I got between this and this." And at least have some semblance of an idea. I think it would be maddening, though, to be like, did I get a 161 or a 164?
Right.
That would drive you crazy. So
this always comes with a degree of madness for sure, of psychological torture. But it also affects the cancellation rates and the bell curve, because if people could see their raw score, even if they didn't know what it translated into, you're going to get biased cancels.
Yep.
Which I know they try to avoid.
Well, that's part of what's going on in July. Is that there's going to be probably a greater, I would assume greater than average level of cancellation. Mm-hmm. So we'll see about that. The GRE and the GMAT, again, they deal with this already. And there's a way for LSAC to move into this scenario. And I think they will eventually. This is the slow transition, though. This is a company that has been static for years and years. I mean, the LSAT effectively hadn't changed, from this paper and pencil format from its inception.
That's right.
And it's been the same basic test since 1991. Yeah, they added comparative reading in 2007. Thank you. Not that big of a deal, really. But this has been a test that has just been sitting there. It's had no competition. They've been a monopolist. And all of a sudden, the world's changing, and they can't figure out who they are. And so this is their headlong rush to try to do all sorts of things. And it's not just the LSAT that you see this. They've released a podcast. And their first podcast was what? Was it 90 seconds long?
It's something like that.
I think I hit play. I turned my head and it was over.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
I remember blinking and missed it.
Yeah, what are you guys doing over there? What did you just say? And it was just statistics. The percentage of people that have taken the LSAT has increased 7%. And then they started a blog.
Yeah.
Lawfully their blog with Kelly Testy, which, that could be a great platform for them. I would love to see them use that to really address some substantive questions and get into the LSAT. But so far, it's just been about legal opportunities. So
my biggest gripe with them, and I think yours as well, certainly high on the list, has been the lack of transparency. If they just communicate with students better, the whole just panoply of complaints would mostly evaporate. When are your scores coming out? Like, how's this test? Like, there's so many things they could do with a greater degree of communication and transparency, and they just refuse to do it. There's this mystique that they like to maintain. It's infuriating and unnecessary.
It's not mystique that they like to maintain. I've said this for years.
Or that's just the outcome of something else?
That's the outcome. That's the effect.
Okay.
The cause is that they do not see students as their clients.
Yeah.
The cause here is that LSAC looks at law schools as their primary clients.
So do you think this degree of open relationship that law schools have recently developed with the GRE, for instance,
their new girlfriend?
That's right. Yeah.
And they're seeing somebody else now.
That's right.
Hey guys.
Yeah. Do you think that that's maybe changed the minds of the people running the show at LSAC?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it affected them because, and I told this to them directly, I'm like, you've lost your monopoly. And I don't think that they believed it then. I don't think they completely believe it yet. I feel like they think that all the changes they've made have turned the corner.
Yeah.
And that they're back on the up. And I think they've done a really good job. I mean, if you're going to take an organization that's been static for so long and make changes like this, it's a lot of work. And I don't know Kelly Testy personally, but she's been the one that's been at the helm for this. And some of it was probably planned beforehand. Some of it was stuff that she's pushed through, but she's done it. And that's really the most important thing, is to get them moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think I'd call her a change for good for the most part.
Yeah.
It's funny you said lost their monopoly, and in my head I heard lost their monogamy, because that to me is really what it is. Law schools have become a bit polyamorous. And when you start to court other tests, you better break out some new moves.
I can tell you that last year, at least, early on and in late 2017, the debates over this were pretty fierce among the people that I know that do law school admissions and LSAT preparation. There was a lot of discussion about what are they going to do? How bad is it going to be? And that didn't materialize because the ABA hasn't approved with finality the use of the GRE as a separate exclusive test. Currently, if you apply to law school and you have an LSAT score and a GRE score, they have to use the LSAT score. So they just ignore your GRE.
That's right.
So until something like that changes, you're not going to see the full-on shift in this field. But it's clear that the GRE's incursion into law school admissions has been the motivating factor in changing how they've been addressing things.
Yeah.
And it's good. They need to be. They need to be more modern, and they needed to get to this level. So I welcome it overall, but
here's hoping their software catches up. So if you had to break down then the coming tests as all right, you're taking March, you're taking June, you're taking July, you're taking September. These are the things to focus on. This is what you do. Let's run through it quickly. If you're taking March, for me, talking to students, you better know September and November cover to cover. Especially the logical reasoning. Those tests have a dynamic that is not entirely unique, but different enough to be worth your time, be well aware of. And I think March is going to duplicate that, even if they happen to pick an older test to reuse. That's my suspicion.
You need to be in tune with the LR on those tests.
Yes. And I think that holds for June as well. The good news about June is you got some time to chill on the writing sample.
You don't have to worry about it.
That's right.
Yeah. And then with July, obviously, it's all about, playing the casino odds of which test
For sure.
you get.
You better be ready for both because you don't know what you're going to get, but you do have this incredible safety net.
Yeah, you really do with the score preview option. Then, of course, at that when July gets closer, we'll narrow in on a prediction because I feel very strongly this is going to be the reuse of probably a recent February test. I know you
Don't give too
always
much away, man.
I already said this in the Crystal Ball seminar.
Yeah,
this is nothing.
I know. You're playing poker with your cards backwards. What are you doing?
Yeah, but I'll still win the game. So
I know. You still
we'll be okay.
Still got a royal flush going over there. So
I can show you my cards if they're really good. In this case, I feel really good about what July is going to be, and we'll just narrow that down. Knowing it's one of 3 or 4 tests isn't that helpful. Knowing that it's maybe one of 2 is a lot more helpful. So
powerful stuff, and we'll definitely
get to that
into
particular point. And then obviously after July, the real focus is these are going to be all digital tests.
Yeah, and you got to know the software, you got to know the tips and tricks, because it is a different experience. Having done both many times, it's different.
It's a change,
but it's not a bad change. There are things about the digital test that are actually beneficial. And I think people are going to be appreciative of that as we get deeper into the year. Yeah.
All right. I think that probably wraps us up.
Cool. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks so much.
I appreciate it. Finish that White Russian.
The ice melted because I didn't really drink a whole lot.
I know. Well, you have been talking a lot.
Catch you later.
Earned it. All right, buddy. Go enjoy the rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for tuning in.